The Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, an introduction to the sutras. This video series is using 3 different commentaries on the Yoga Sutras. The commentary by B.K.S. Iyengar called Light on the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. The commentary by Sri Swami Satchidananda called the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. And the commentary by Alice A. Bailey called The Light of the Soul. This comparative study through this video series is done by Dr. Lisa Love. So before we begin the specific study on the Yoga Sutras, let's answer the question, what is yoga? The word yoga in many ways means yug or join. But yoga also means union and has existed for a very long time as a practice in Eastern cultures. In recent years, yoga has been having an increasing impact on the Western world. But what exactly is yoga? For too many Westerners, yoga is like a gym exercise. And you engage in yoga primarily for the physical benefits of increased flexibility, greater circulation and immunity, and extra stamina. Well, that's well and good, but yoga is actually much more than this. Though the physical benefits of yoga are important, there are many kinds of yoga that address much more than the physical. Let's look at some. So there are a variety of types of yoga, and each seeks a greater level of union, realization of, or integration with the self, which can also be known as the spiritual self, I call it the peaceful self, that you already are. We will briefly look at a few types of yoga, including the following. Hatha Yoga, which primarily impacts the physical body. Kundalini Yoga, which primarily works through the energy body. Bhakti Yoga, which primarily accesses the emotional body. Jana Yoga, which is primarily focused through the mental body, and Raja Yoga, also the kingly yoga of self-realization. Now, actually, all these different kinds of yogas can interpenetrate the different levels of self, mental, emotional, energy, and physical body. But each yoga system primarily impacts a certain area. Let's look at each one of these in a little more depth. Starting with Hatha Yoga. Hatha Yoga, as I said, is primarily the yoga of the physical body. Through a series of poses or asanas, you learn to master the various systems of the physical body. The positives of this type of yoga is that it brings about greater physical health, flexibility, and vitality, and it gives greater stamina for treading on the spiritual path. The negatives is that it can make you too body conscious, keeping you mostly at the level of body awareness. That is why many yoga schools, including the one B.K.S. Iyergar started in, considered Hatha Yoga as the least essential form of yoga, though Iyengar and others greatly enhanced its importance and value in modern times. Next, Kundalini Yoga. Kundalini works primarily with the energy body, which corresponds with the nervous system. The goal is to open up the energy vortexes or chakras in the body so that the energy rises up the central channel of the body that corresponds with the central nervous system. Technically, its name is Sushumna. The awakening of the Kundalini is similar to tapping into the Holy Spirit energy of Christianity. Once opened, it can bring about mystical states and awaken psychic powers. Unfortunately, if the Kundalini is awakened before the person is ready, serious psychological and spiritual problems can also happen, and the energy body may be damaged instead of aided in the process. Next, there's Bhakti Yoga. Bhakti Yoga is a devotional yoga that primarily engages the emotions. Here you give your heart to whoever is inspiring devotion. It can be a spiritual person no longer in the body like Jesus, Mary, the Buddha, White Tara, Great Spirit, Krishna, Rama, Allah, Muhammad, Jehovah. The names are many. Or it can be a living person such as the Pope, the Dalai Lama, or anyone you give your heart to. Hopefully by doing so, you open up more fully to the energy of love and become an embodiment of that love energy as well. When that devotion becomes narrow or fanatical, the opposite can happen, with this devotion causing you to love only the object of your devotion, rejecting all others. Next, there's Jana Yoga. Jana Yoga is primarily a yoga that trains the mind to think intelligently and with discernment along certain lines. It is considered an intellectual and philosophical yoga. The person can become a master of various intellectual subject matter. A powerful, focused, and steady mind can also make this person fairly powerful in the world. The drawbacks of this yoga is that the person may become too head-focused and lack heart. He or she may also become so fixated on intellectual subject matter that he or she becomes narrow-minded or impractical in his or her ability to function in the world. Then there is Raja Yoga. As we said, this is the kingly yoga or the crown jewel of yoga. Raja Yoga in many ways is a synthesis of the other yogas. It builds on Hatha Yoga, Kundalini Yoga, Bhakti Yoga, and Jana Yoga, but goes farther, working more specifically on the eradication of the selfish nature as one penetrates deeply into one's true nature and thus realizes the self. The Yoga Sutras of Patanjali are said to comprise a Raja Yoga system. Recently, however, with the work of Sri Aurobindo and Sri Swami Satchidananda and others, there have been attempts to create an integral yoga, which further synthesizes all current knowledge of former yoga systems. Now that we have a brief understanding of what is yoga, well, who is Patanjali? Patanjali may have been one individual, but scholars also feel it could have been more than one person who used the name Patanjali over the centuries. Either one or more of these Patanjalis have been said to have written the Mahabhasya and the Yoga Sutras, as well as coming up with the medical system of Ayurveda. Most scholars claim that Patanjali lived around the 2nd century BCE, which is around 300 years after the Buddha and about 200 years before Christ. Some place him around 400 BCE and claim he was also known as Samkhya. Regardless of his true origin or true identity, one thing is clear. His Yoga Sutras have stood the test of time and remain as a major source of guidance in step-by-step processes to help one achieve yoga or union and self-realization. So in this video series, as I have said, I'm using 3 different books and looking at their commentaries. Now, I have actually gone through the Yoga Sutras and looked at a variety of commentaries. I've gone through probably about 10 different books, but I'm choosing 3 of my favorites here for this comparative study. The first is by B.K.S. Iyengar, and as mentioned at the beginning of this video, I'm using his Light on the Yoga Sutras of Pantanjali book. Now, B.K.S. Iyengar was a modern-day spiritual teacher of yoga who only recently left his body as of 2014, and is perhaps best known for his in-depth understanding of Hatha Yoga and a spreading of yoga classes focusing primarily on yoga postures or asanas throughout the world. But Iyengar was far from simply a Hatha yogi. He had a deep understanding of the yoga tradition at all levels, and his commentary, Light on the Yoga Sutras of Pantanjali, is profound. That's one of the reasons why we're using it in this series. Then we're using the book by Sri Swami Satchidananda. Sri Swami Satchidananda gained popularity in the Western world at Woodstock in the 1960s. He went on to set up the spiritual community Yogaville in Virginia in the United States, and for decades helped spread an integral approach to yoga throughout the world. His commentary on the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali is a highly accessible translation, using his humor, practical wisdom, depth of knowledge, and various storytelling to make the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali come to life. The third book I'm using is actually the very first book I read decades ago on the Yoga Sutras, and this is by Alice A. Bailey. Alice Bailey was a Western woman who was far ahead of her time. She wrote her translation of the Yoga Sutras, called The Light of the Soul, in the 1920s, at a time few women had any educational background. Raised Christian, she focused on the esoteric meaning of the Christian faith, drawing numerous parallels between the Eastern Yoga teachings and the esoteric Christian tradition. Her translation is at times complex, but her book is included here because of its Western slant and depth. Now, as you see as we go through these videos, when I'm doing these comparisons with these three books, I'm also creating a lot of visuals that will help you understand how these three systems and three commentaries fit together. Now, we're studying three main books in terms of their commentary, but to let you know, there are four main books or portions or sections of the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali themselves. So let me introduce you to what those are. The first one is Book 1, or the portion on contemplation, and that's Samadhi Pada. Pada means portion, Samadhi means contemplation. And that's how Iyengar and Satchidananda titled this book. Bailey calls it the problem of union. So we are learning more about Samadhi or contemplation, and we are contemplating what happens when we achieve union. And there are 51 sutras, lessons, or stanzas in Book 1. Book 2 is the portion on practice, the Sadhana Pada, or Bailey calls it the steps to union, and there are 55 sutras, lessons, or stanzas in this one. Book 3 is the portion on accomplishments, the Vibhuti-pada, or union achieved in its results, as Bailey calls it, and there are 55 sutras. And Book 4 is the portion on absoluteness, or the Kaivalya-pada, or Bailey calls it the book on illumination, and there are 34 sutras in this one. So let's do a brief, more in-depth summary of each one of these books, starting with Book 1, the portion on contemplation, or the problem of union. Starting with a quote from B.K.S. Iyengar. This book starts with the need for a disciplined code of conduct to educate us towards spiritual poise and peace under all circumstances. That's one reason why I call it the Peaceful Self process. Now, that process doesn't relate just to the Yoga Sutras. That's a process that I have specifically developed that is also a psycho-spiritual process. But the goal is to achieve spiritual poise and peace under all circumstances. And the Yoga Sutras help us get there, which is one reason why I've gone into an in-depth study again, and I'm doing these videos to help you. Book 1 lets us know that yoga is about union with the self that we are. It then outlines how we achieve union with the self by learning to, here's another quote, this one is actually from Swami Satchidananda, we learn how to restrain the modifications of the mind stuff, which are known as chitta, or here's another way to spell it, C-I-T-T-A, which is more than just the mind. Chitta is more than the mind. It includes restraint of the ego, also known as the ahamkara. As we do this, we go through various levels of samadhi, which is focused concentration. First with seed thoughts, this is samadhi or meditation with seed. Then without seed, we reach the samadhi levels where we are no longer using a mantra or a seed thought or anything like that until we reach self-realization. Then the observer and the observed, the seer and the seer become one. From there we learn to abide within this self that we are. So Book 1 is very much about the different types of samadhi, there are several, and how we can use each one of those to help us restrain the modifications of the mind stuff, restrain the ego, so that we can become aware of the self we are, ideally 24/7. Wow, what a lot to go through. But that's only Book 1. Next, there's Book 2. The portion on practice, the Sadhana Pada, or steps to union. These are the practical steps that we take The sadhana is the practitioner who, here's another quote, skillfully applies his mind and intelligence and practice towards a spiritual goal. That quote's from B.K.S. Iyengar. Book 2 provides the important foundation for living a pure and moral life so that we may begin to overcome, more quotes from Iyengar, suffering, also known as the klesas, ignorance, avidya, pride or egoism, asmita, attachment, raga, aversion, divesa, and fear of death and clinging to life, abhinivesa. And I hope I'm saying those words correctly. Nobody has ever said them to me, so I am just making my best intelligent guess, and I think I'm pretty close. So as you can see, Book 2 is more about the moral foundations that help us to overcome these various things. It is also done primarily by following the 5 yamas. So we're introduced to the yamas and the niyamas in Book 2. The 5 yamas are ahimsa, or nonviolence, satya, which is truthfulness, asteya, non-stealing, brahmacharya, continence, and aparigraha, freedom from avarice. It is also done, as I said, by following the 5 niyamas, the yamas and the niyamas. The 5 niyamas are sukha, purity, santosa, contentment, tapas, religious fervor, sadvadhyaya, study of scripture and self, and isvara pranidayana, surrender of the ego to God or the self. So now that we have learned about the different kinds of samadhi that take us into union in Book 1, and we built the moral foundation practicing the yamas and niyamas in Book 2, we start to have the accomplishments or union and its results. As the mind becomes increasingly focused and concentrated, various powers can arise that seem supernatural in comparison to most human beings. And Patanjali lists at least 34 various mind powers that can emerge as the mind becomes increasingly tranquil and steady and is no longer influenced by pleasure or pain. But Patanjali warns that these mind powers can actually become a problem. If the practitioner becomes carried away with them, then they will feed the ego rather than absorb that ego into the self. So the goal is to press beyond a desire to cultivate these powers or give them undue attention should they arise, and instead deepen the practice as revealed in Book 4 in order to obtain liberation. So this is a very important book, and you can obtain these powers whether you are training the mind through the Yoga Sutras or you're training the mind in various contemplative practices in a monastery or in a university, wherever the mind becomes powerful. But it's very important to understand, and Patanjali wrote this like 2,400 years ago, that mind powers are not spiritual powers and can actually make you more egotistical instead of less so, hence the danger. But if we don't get caught up in those mind powers in Book 3, we can go into Book 4, which is the portion on absoluteness or illumination. Kaivalya means liberation or emancipation. Here's a quote from Iyengar again. It is an absolute, indivisible state of existence. In it, the yogi is stripped of thoughts, mind, intellect, and ego, and freed from the play of the gunas of nature, which is explained in the Yoga Sutras. These 3 gunas are sattva, rajas, and tamas, and he becomes a guna titan, a pure, flawless person. Don't you love these words? I love his choice of words with Iyengar. They're so wonderful. Here's another quote from him. Progressively, one disentangles oneself from life's preoccupations with dharma, or duty, artha, the means of livelihood, and karma, worldly enjoyment. This transcendence leads to freedom or moksha. With the consciousness at peace and free, one is primarily focused on service in the world. So it's very important to understand that you don't stop doing anything. You still are serving in the world. In a sense, that's a dharma. You still may get some sort of compensation, even if it's in the way of food, if you're a wandering beggar in India. And there still may be action, but it's action that is freed of selfish motivation. So it's not karma in the traditional sense. Instead, it's about being primarily a world server. You remain within that peaceful self you are, and in that steady, centered place, you serve in the world. Isn't that beautiful? So, as you can see, I have a little bit of passion for this, and I'm very excited to present this series of videos to you. But let me explain how I would like you to proceed as you go through these videos in our work together. As we go through the videos I've created for each sutra, you are encouraged to do so in the following way. 1. Obtain copies of the 3 books we are using so that you may get your own impressions and a more complete understanding of what each author has to say on each sutra. There is so much more that each author says than I can condense and summarize in a video. I am just getting to the pithy points that each person is presenting and providing you with illustrations to help you embody or more deeply understand what they're saying. But they say so much more than I can put in these videos. Otherwise, I would simply be taking each of these books and doing videos on them, which would take forever, and it would not benefit the different organizations that serve these different 3 wonderful teachers that I'm borrowing this stuff from. So please, please, please get the books and follow along with the videos. Then attempt to work with only 1 sutra a week. Watch the video and then read what the different authors have to say in the various books. You can watch the video again then to deepen your understanding even more. I'm doing my best to synthesize and illustrate these concepts. And 3, you can follow the meditations that week. In fact, I encourage you to follow the meditations many times that I've created for each sutra. Remember, the point is to practice, not just study. And that's a big part of these videos that I've created, is the meditations for each sutra. These are my innovations, my meditations. That doesn't mean that you'll only find them through me. I've been inspired by many different teachers and practices in my decades of study and practice. But to my knowledge, this is the only time the Yoga Sutras have been paired with these kinds of meditations in videos online. And I put them there because I really want to emphasize it's about practicing the sutras, not just studying them. And finally, if you decide to take this course not as a self-study, but with me directly, then you are welcome to share your questions, comments, and experiences with me, and I will answer as best as I can from my own understanding. It will be my delight to participate with you in this process. So there you have the introduction to the Yoga Sutras. I'm really excited to have you as part of this particular process. And if you want to know more about me and how you can follow along in the Yoga Sutras with me, either as self-study or directly with me through email or on the phone or through Skype, then you can read more in the next 2 slides. Namaste.